Welcome back again. We're going to start the first afternoon session with short talks. And short talks means that the speakers are going to have 15 minutes to tell their story. And then this will allow us to have another 5 minutes of questions and discussion. And we are going to start with Amanda Bayley, who is going from Bath Spa University. You have all the information in the screen. And who is going to talk about developing an intercultural performance practice. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks. The scholarly shift from an interest in the product to the processes used to create music might be traced back to anthropologist Alan Merriam's 1964 idea of creative performance within the category of composition. More recently, ethnomusicologist Timothy Cooley expands on this shift. Referring to the collection and codification system of Zoltan Kodály and Béla Bartók, he acknowledges that their taxonomic work of a century ago continues and remains significant. But today we need to understand the cultures of exchange that have always been a part of musical identity. Most of you will have heard yesterday about this project, Beyond East and West, developing and documenting an evolving transcultural musical practice, which I am working on. The ethnographic research I am conducting within this project reveals specific ways that cultures of exchange can be investigated. This screenshot is taken from the project website. Top left and bottom right shows the composer-performer discussions. Top right shows the oud and its playing techniques in the recording studio. And this is just one of many examples of classical and folk instruments that we have been filming and recording that will eventually be an online resource to help composers write for Turkish instruments. Bottom left is an example from workshops with the Hezarfen ensemble, including student and professional composers trying out new pieces incorporating Turkish instruments with Western instruments. Ethnomusicologist Benjamin Brunner provides a framework for considering how roles are played out. Relationships in an interactive network are characterized not only by the amount of control or influence exerted, the domains affected and the responsiveness of others, but by directionality, the flow of influences and information. The following examples illustrate how the directionality or flow of creativity works, both through conversation and through musicking, often as a two-way process. Workshops and rehearsals since April 2016 begin to address the following questions. How can musicians playing Turkish traditional instruments learn or understand how Western classically trained musicians think in order to play new music that embraces different traditions? And here are two musicians, one of whom you'll recognize from last night, Nermin on the kemençe, and someone else on Miaze on ney, and they both read Western notation. Conversely, how can classically trained musicians learn or understand how players of traditional Turkish instruments think in order to play new music that embraces different traditions? And this workshop is led by the Bağlama player on the left. A further question is, are we trying to invent a new way where the composer tries to write everything down? And how far can that thinking go? In other words, are we in the project responding to the gulf between notation-based and oral traditions by bringing them together, integrating them through new notation or through a new performance style, or some mixture of the two? The starting point is respecting each other's traditions, then creating something new, which requires an openness to new ways of learning and acquiring knowledge, as discussed in an article by Stefan Osterzo and Tan Tui in 2013. There seem to be three stages to the learning. Oh, sorry, before I do that, let's just hear an example of a makam played by the ney player. There seem to be three stages to the learning: acquisition, translation, and transformation. Transformation is more of a long-term goal tracked over a longer period of time in relation to new possibilities that arise. Translation, however, arises from members of Hezarfen ensemble during the first workshop.
I had this once, 10 pages of description for a 3-page of music. It's like this, and actually this is something I from my side want that everybody of us is able to work in that way, that we learn first and then we translate this with our taste also. personal taste.
Yeah.
You know? We are not here to say, okay, the rules like this, so I have to play like this, because we are still individual musicians. But we have to learn.
But first you learn and you
Yes.
try to make
Yes,
it
yeah,
right.
of course.
Then you
Of
have
course.
your interpretation.
Acquisition is described by the clarinetist.
Because to my ears, I'm very sorry, I'm a Western instrument musician, but I'm Turkish. But to my ear, all sounds like that, an interval is also living. It's not a static interval.
Yes.
It's a moving, like we are
Yes.
playing.
Yes.
That's why we cannot write it.
It's the
No.
main
It's the
concern.
main issue.
But
I would like also to compare this a little bit with Baroque style
Yeah.
playing, because in Baroque style playing it's not written as we play.
yeah, I know.
So we just learn, we just
Yeah.
study all that, and we change rhythms on French Baroque or Italian Baroque, etc. etc. So we just need to study a little bit enough,
Yes.
but we also need some guidelines.
For members of Hesafen, an emphasis on practice and listening focuses on developments of sound, instrumental technique and expression. The player's focus is to determine what technique or action is needed to produce a particular sound, which might be determined by a composer's instructions or by a new performance style from a traditional Turkish instrument. In the next extract, Michael Ellison queries how the ney player achieves the appropriate sound of the inhale-exhale direction in a piece composed by Onur Türkmen. Here, in the next extract, Onur explains what he wants.
For me, for the first time, I worked with a ney player, I mean really in detail with the breath tone. And she found out a way to really play. So how do you play the breath tone on ney? Because first of all, I'm so sorry, there are two types of breath tones, I asked. One is with pitch, so this is half pitch, half breath. The other one is just breath, just noise. Okay.
Half pitch and half breath, I take my mouth away from this başpare.
Then the flautist contributes with his experience of performing contemporary music.
I have a suggestion to you. Generally, in flute too, when I first came to Hesafen, I played a piece from Taner solo piece, and he had lots of these breath tones, and it was forte, fortissimo and stuff. You have some crescendos and decrescendos, and for this difference, you can use your teeth. You can basically, like without ney, can you do? Ya neysiz.
That's right.
Neysiz. Evet. O benim. Bayağı. Evet bayağı. Bu çok güzel bir breath tone efekti yapıyor. Aynı zamanda bunun tonunu da kullanırsınız, tonsuz da. Yani flütsüz zaten. Ve onu hemen bir hile gibi kullanıyorum. Eğer if the composer wants without tone, I use it like a cheat and but when we match with the flute and directly, you do all without, and it sounds like the same with flute.
Considerable time is spent learning a new style and tradition of playing. The next extract is from a workshop led by the Balama player, Erdem Şimşek, demonstrating ornamentation and trills for the players to copy.
And can you make another ornamentation here? Just a grace note before repetition.
Another example is a workshop led by Nermin on kemençe. Each player took turns to copy her, then played with her, first as an individual, then in a group. Whichever music tradition we are accustomed to and trained in, we are all familiar with the fact that notation fixes the melody or tune, but not how to perform it. And here you can see one of the players' attempts to annotate the basic notation with penciled inflections, accentuation, glissandi, and bowing instructions. A development in the performers' workshops over the last 2 years has been the recent contribution by the violinist and scholar Murat Gürel, who first contributed to performers' workshops in December 2017. Murat teaches Hezarfen players through combining makam theory and practice by listening and copying, singing and playing. Playing is from his detailed transcription, which you can see an example of here, based on the performance style of Buhuazada Mustafa Itri, the master of Turkish classical music from the 17th century. This example shows him explaining how to read, listen, copy and play his annotations, where GLG here means glissando grace, F vib means fast vibrato, and U before TR means uncertain trill.
Glissando grace also with pushing fingers each other, mi to sol, I'm playing listen. Mi sol fa sol mi re, mi sol fa sol mi re. Let's play together with down bow sol fa 1, 2. Nice again 1, 2. Let's play beginning from sentence 3 lastly. Let's play sentence 3. 1, 2. Continue please. 1, 2.
Just from these few examples, we begin to see how different performance techniques, styles and vocabularies are communicated through varying combinations of notation and sound. Analysing performers' learning processes can help to address the gap between oral and notated traditions and empower musicians to compose or play in an unfamiliar tradition. Identifying the nature of a performer's transformation can help to establish some kind of intercultural performance practice. Documenting this change in action helps to develop ideas surrounding orality and literacy. During the course of the project, I plan to arrive at a representation of creative flow generated from dialogue and musicking, identifying the various processes of translation that underpin rich transformations of musical technique and expression. Thank you.
Very intense and very clear presentation, and for keeping the time. Thank you very much for the presentation and for keeping the time. And now we have 5 minutes for questions if anyone wants to ask or comment anything. We have one now.
Thanks. I have a question about what you were mentioning with regards to intense notation. Have you found that over time the Western musicians who might be learning makam for the first time, is their reliance on notation diminishing as they kind of learn, sort of as it becomes more instinctive, or they further understand the trills? Or
That's an interesting question, and I wish Uli was here, who was playing last night, because he would have been the ideal person to answer that question, obviously. I think at the moment, well, because this is Murat, who entered quite just months ago in December, it's quite a recent addition, and we've had 2 more workshops since then in February and April. I think the presence of notation helps. And some, I mean, the Hesarfen ensemble do improvise, and they're used to playing, and some more than others probably in improvising. So they're keen to move away from the notation. In fact, Uli mentioned to me, in fact, last night about, because I was scanning them, making sure we documented what the music they used in the performance. I scanned it afterwards, and he actually commented that he didn't write anything in the part. So actually, it's the same as Nermin's part, because he permits it to memory, turns it to memory so that he doesn't rely on it in the notation. So I think that's probably quite an individual thing that would be different for different players. I mean, there's another level I can answer that question as myself, as the researcher, because I hadn't anticipated actually being involved in the playing and in the workshops myself. But as a viola player, I've been joining in the workshops since August, that workshop with Nermin that I showed. And that's brought a different access point for me as well, of not just observing it as more of a distance, but actually being involved in that learning process. So, and actually when Murat suddenly appeared with this more detailed notation, I suddenly felt more comfortable with that, shamedly probably, but unfortunately, I'm trained in that way that actually more notation helps to get into that style, but it's a mixture. It's a mixture of approach, I would say, with listening, copying, imitating, singing. That's been a really interesting angle for me as well.
We have time for more questions.
Thank you for the very cool talk. It's so interesting to see the interaction between people from non-Western musical cultures interacting with Westerns. And seeing it makes me wonder, what if you had, because I guess you're looking at multiple different cultures, but they're all interacting with Western musicians, but what if people from these different traditions were trying to teach each other their different techniques?
That's also happening, and in fact it is Turkish traditions, but of course there are so many of them, whether it's the makam tradition or different folk traditions in different regions of Turkey, and that's why our resource of recording instrumentalists and singers in the studio is going to be a rich resource for composers. But interestingly, when we've got the makam trained musicians, and even apparently they don't even agree. And in fact, somebody in this room, yes, you were telling me yesterday about the canon players disagreeing in fact. So even when they're within the same tradition, there is disagreement and there are discussions. Unfortunately, because I don't know any Turkish language really, that's all translated for me as well in this project. So I get to hear some of those, I will get to understand more about those conversations. But that's even within a tradition, let alone, but the makam tradition musicians and the folk traditions like Erdem Şimşek, who I showed, everyone's joining in those workshops. They're not exclusive, so it is a mixture. So it's an intra-cultural experience as well as an intercultural experience.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Well, I will make the question myself. Nothing, I'm always interested in the past. And is there any connection of any of this contemporary Turkish music with the music that was written down? For example, thinking about Dimitri Cantemir and that famous collection of music in the 18th century. Is there any connection in the kind of music and the kind of...
I'm not sure. No, I'm not sure I can answer that question really.
Yeah, okay. No,
yeah, sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again, Amanda. And